She was 5 months pregnant, glowing, hopeful, and devoted to the little life growing inside her. Friends said she was radiant that summer, balancing work, motherhood, and the anticipation of welcoming another child. But on an ordinary July afternoon in 2005, LaToyia Figueroa walked out of a prenatal appointment in Philadelphia and disappeared without a trace. What began as a missing person report would soon unfold into one of Pennsylvania's most haunting cases. A story of betrayal, heartbreak, and the fight for justice in a world that almost didn't notice she was gone. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. In the summer of 2005, Philadelphia was alive with heat and movement. The streets pulsed with city life, corner stores humming with conversation, buses hissing along Broad Street, the air heavy with the sound of children playing under the long evening sun. It was a city of neighborhoods, each with its own rhythm and heartbeat. For 24-year-old LaToyia Figueroa, this city wasn't just home, it was her world. She had roots here, family, a close circle of friends, and a deep devotion to the people she loved most, especially her 7-year-old daughter. Those who knew LaToyia described her as responsible, caring, and determined. She balanced her job as a waitress with motherhood and pregnancy, and she did it with quiet strength. Her co-workers said she had a gentle laugh and an easy presence that brightened long shifts. Family members recalled that she was careful and thoughtful, not the kind of person who would ever just vanish. She was proud of her role as a mother, protective of her child, and looking forward to expanding her family. At the time, she was living in West Philadelphia, a working-class area filled with small row homes, churches, and corner groceries. She was raising her daughter largely on her own, but was in contact with Stephen Poches, the father of her unborn baby. Their relationship was complicated, not openly hostile, but strained by questions of responsibility and commitment. Still, when she had a prenatal appointment on July 18, 2005, she agreed to go with Poches. It was a simple visit, routine, something expectant mothers across the city did every day. But for LaToyia, it would be her last known act before disappearing into silence. That summer, the city was preoccupied with other stories. The continuing buzz of national news about the disappearance of Natalie Holloway in Aruba had captivated the media. Television screens and newspapers were filled with her face, her story. But in West Philadelphia, another young woman, also missing, also loved, struggled to attract attention. The difference, as many would later point out, was not just geography or circumstance, but race and class. For the Figueroa family, the lack of coverage added another layer of pain to an already unbearable reality. Still, within her community, LaToyia's disappearance sent shockwaves. Friends and family immediately sensed something was wrong. It wasn't like her to miss work, to not pick up her daughter, or to go days without calling her father or her cousin. Her loved ones began calling hospitals, checking with friends, retracing her steps. There was no word, no sign, no trace. It was as though she had simply vanished into the summer air. Her father, Jose Figueroa, refused to stay quiet. He reached out to local police, filed a missing persons report, and began contacting the media. At first, the response was muted, another missing adult in a large city. But Jose knew his daughter. She was not someone who would run off or abandon her child. Something terrible had happened, and he was determined to find out what. Over the next few days, her loved ones organized searches, passed out flyers, and begged for coverage. A few local journalists picked up the story, but it wasn't until the online community, particularly bloggers and activists, began to amplify her disappearance that momentum truly began to build. Bloggers like Richard Blair and Philadelphia journalist Mark Seufer used their platforms to share LaToyia's story, pushing for visibility. They questioned why her case wasn't receiving the same urgency as others across the country. The movement that began online quickly spread, and soon major outlets could no longer ignore the growing outcry. But before the public attention reached its peak, the family lived through agonizing days of uncertainty. Every ring of the phone brought hope and fear in equal measure. Each call to the police ended with the same refrain. They were looking, but there were no leads. Meanwhile, those closest to her tried to piece together what had happened in those final hours. According to investigators, after her prenatal appointment, Stephen Poches told police that he and LaToyia went to his apartment in southwest Philadelphia. He claimed that after a short visit, she left calmly around 5 p.m. to go pick up her daughter. But that account raised immediate doubts among her family. It didn't fit her pattern. She was scheduled to work that night, and missing a shift without calling in was out of character. Her co-workers at the restaurant hadn't seen her. Her daughter's babysitter said she never arrived. The trail went cold almost instantly. As daylight faded that first night, Jose Figueroa drove through the streets, calling her name, scanning the sidewalks, hoping for any sign. Family members checked parks, hospitals, and transit stations, but there was nothing. No phone calls, no bank activity, no witnesses who saw her after leaving Poch's apartment. Each day that passed deepened the dread. By midweek, the search had become citywide. Volunteers joined in, distributing posters with her photo, a smiling young woman with warm brown eyes and a soft expression. Her face became a haunting reminder of how easily a life could vanish. The family's plea was simple: help us find her. Yet, for all their efforts, the early investigation produced little progress. Police questioned Poches and others close to her but found no immediate evidence of foul play. Without a crime scene, a confession, or physical proof, the case teetered in uncertainty. But as Jose Figueroa continued to press for answers, others began to take notice. The disparity between her case and others in national media became a topic of discussion, fueling both empathy and frustration. Activists pointed to a pattern. Missing women of color often struggled to gain the same level of media attention, resources, and public empathy as their white counterparts. LaToyia's disappearance became part of a broader conversation about who gets seen and who gets overlooked in moments of crisis. As days turned into weeks, the question weighed heavily on everyone involved. What could have happened that day to change everything so suddenly? The sense of mystery surrounding her case deepened, but beneath the confusion, one truth became clear. Those who loved her would not rest until they found her. They were determined to bring her home, no matter what it took. The city, once indifferent, was beginning to listen. The story of a missing pregnant woman, a devoted mother, a beloved daughter, was no longer invisible. And though no one yet knew it, the path to justice had already begun to take shape, far from the public eye. In the coming weeks, that path would lead investigators to a shocking discovery, one buried not only in the earth but in lies, fear, and the darkest corners of human betrayal. But for now, as the summer sun faded over Philadelphia, the city stood divided between hope and dread, waiting for a sign, a clue, anything that could bring LaToyia home. July 18, 2005. It began as a normal day, the kind that should have ended with LaToyia Figueroa returning home to her daughter and preparing for another shift at the restaurant. Instead, it became the day her loved ones would remember for the rest of their lives. The day when time split into before and after. That morning, LaToyia followed her usual routine. She got her daughter ready for the day, checked in with family, and prepared to attend her scheduled prenatal appointment. She was about 5 months pregnant, just beginning to show, and had been looking forward to hearing the baby's heartbeat again. Her pregnancy wasn't easy. She had been balancing long hours at work and the challenges of single motherhood, but she remained determined to provide a good life for her children. She had arranged to meet the father of her unborn child, Stephen Poches, that afternoon. Poches, a 25-year-old man from southwest Philadelphia, worked as a security guard. Their relationship had grown complicated in recent months. Friends of LaToyia recalled that she wasn't sure how deeply she could trust him, but she tried to keep the peace for the sake of her unborn child. The two had argued before, sometimes about money, sometimes about responsibility, but there had been no outward sign of danger, at least none that anyone recognized. The appointment took place at a local clinic. According to witnesses and later police reports, everything appeared normal. The visit ended, and the two were seen leaving together. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the sun was bright over Philadelphia. From there, the trail becomes murky. Poches later told police that they drove back to his apartment in southwest Philadelphia, a short trip of about 15 minutes. They talked for a while, he said, and then she left his home around 5 p.m. to pick up her daughter. That was his version. But there were no confirmed sightings of her after that. No surveillance footage, no phone records showing calls made after that time. The digital silence that followed was chilling. By that evening, LaToyia's absence was already alarming. She hadn't shown up for her shift at the restaurant. She hadn't picked up her daughter. Friends began calling her phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. Her father, Jose Figueroa, immediately knew something was wrong. LaToyia wasn't careless, she was responsible, protective, and deeply connected to her family. For her not to check in was unthinkable. Jose began calling around, checking hospitals and local police stations. Nothing. No record of her being admitted anywhere. No sign of a car accident, no arrest, no clue. As the hours stretched into the night, fear set in. The next morning, Jose filed an official missing persons report with the Philadelphia Police Department. In missing person cases, the first 48 hours are crucial, but early on there seemed to be little urgency from authorities. Perhaps they assumed she'd left voluntarily, or that she'd return soon. But Jose knew his daughter. She wouldn't abandon her 7-year-old child. She wouldn't vanish in silence. So he took matters into his own hands. Within days, he organized search parties, distributing flyers across the city. Friends, co-workers, and neighbors joined in. They combed through West and Southwest Philadelphia, retracing every possible route she could have taken home from that prenatal visit. Her face appeared on utility poles, bus stops, and shop windows. The words, "Missing, LaToyia Figueroa," began to circulate, slowly at first, then with growing intensity. But something else was happening at the same time. A stark reminder of the inequalities that existed in how missing persons were treated in the media. Around the country, news channels were saturated with coverage of another missing woman, Natalie Holloway, a white teenager from Alabama who had disappeared in Aruba just weeks earlier. Her story dominated national headlines, but when LaToyia vanished in Philadelphia, a young black woman, pregnant, and from a working-class background, the silence was almost total. Her family and friends noticed. So did a few journalists and bloggers who would later play a vital role in keeping her case alive. One of them was Richard Blair, a Philadelphia-based blogger who wrote passionately about media bias. He published posts demanding attention for LaToyia's disappearance, calling out the disparity in national coverage. Others followed suit, and slowly, public pressure began to grow. Local radio stations picked up the story, then newspapers, and eventually national networks began to take notice. But attention alone wasn't enough. The leads were scarce, and the timeline was painfully thin. Investigators questioned those closest to her, friends, co-workers, family, and especially Stephen Poches, the last known person to see her alive. His account never changed. She left his apartment peacefully, but something about his demeanor unsettled detectives. His answers felt too rehearsed, too neat. Meanwhile, the community continued to mobilize. Volunteers searched wooded areas, abandoned lots, and vacant properties. They distributed thousands of flyers and posters. A local businessman donated funds to increase the reward for information, which eventually reached $100,000, an enormous sum for a community-driven case. Despite these efforts, days turned into weeks with no breakthroughs. Every night, Jose Figueroa prayed for his daughter's safe return. Every morning, he woke to the same silence. Police followed up on tips, sightings that turned out to be false, calls from strangers who thought they recognized her face. Each one led to another dead end. Inside the police department, investigators began quietly building a profile. They looked deeper into LaToyia's life, her relationships, her recent activities. One pattern stood out. Her last interactions all pointed back to Poches. The connection between them was unavoidable, and the inconsistencies in his story grew harder to ignore. As tension mounted, the family faced another painful challenge: the public's shifting attention. Even after national outlets briefly mentioned her case, the coverage soon faded. Other stories took precedence, and for many outside Philadelphia, her name disappeared as quickly as she had. But inside the city, her family refused to let her memory fade. They appeared on local talk shows, organized vigils, and continued searching every corner they could. By early August, nearly a month had passed since she was last seen. The city's summer heat had grown oppressive. For many, hope was dimming, but her father clung to the belief that she might still be alive somewhere. "Until I see otherwise," he told reporters, "I'll keep looking. I'll never stop looking." Meanwhile, investigators began re-examining earlier interviews. A tip had come in suggesting that someone close to Poches might have information they hadn't shared. Detectives followed up discreetly, tracing his movements in the days after LaToyia's disappearance. They learned that he had borrowed a car from a friend, and his behavior during that period raised new suspicions. Still, without physical evidence, without a body, the case remained officially open but stagnant. The city seemed to hold its breath. Flyers faded in the heat, their corners curling on telephone poles. The face of the missing young woman had become both familiar and haunting, a silent plea staring back from every intersection. And yet, somewhere beneath the surface, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. For Jose and the rest of the family, each day brought renewed agony. They were grateful for the volunteers, the strangers who showed up to help search, but every unsuccessful outing left them more desperate. What began as hope was slowly hardening into the fear that she would never come home alive. Then came a break, a whisper of information from someone who knew more than they'd admitted before. A friend of Poches had noticed something suspicious, something that didn't sit right. He eventually came forward, quietly sharing what he knew with investigators. It would take weeks before that tip led police to the truth, but when it did, it would unravel the mystery piece by piece. For now, though, the Figueroa family remained trapped in the unbearable tension between hope and despair, waiting for the phone call that could either save or shatter them. The investigation was about to shift, from a search for a missing woman to the pursuit of a killer. But the question still lingered in everyone's mind. At this point in the investigation, what would you have suspected first? As the hours bled into days, the uncertainty surrounding LaToyia's disappearance deepened into fear. Her family, friends, and co-workers clung to the hope that she might walk through the door, explaining everything, that maybe she had needed time alone, that maybe there was a misunderstanding. But as each day passed, hope became harder to sustain. What began as concern had grown into a citywide search for a woman and her unborn child. Detectives from the Philadelphia Police Department's Homicide and Missing Persons units began canvassing the area where she was last seen, near the 48th and Market Street corridor, a busy stretch lined with row homes and corner stores. Witnesses recalled seeing her earlier that day, smiling, dressed casually for the warm July afternoon. She had just left a prenatal appointment and had planned to pick up her daughter before heading home. But after that, the trail went cold. Officers checked hospitals, shelters, and local precincts. Flyers with LaToyia's photo, her warm eyes and calm smile, were distributed across the city. Her friends and family flooded television stations and community boards with pleas for information. She wouldn't just disappear, her father said during one of the earliest press briefings. She has a daughter. She was expecting another. She was happy. Those words became a rallying cry for a community that couldn't accept her vanishing without a trace. The initial days of investigation revealed few tangible leads. Her cell phone was inactive, her bank accounts untouched. There were no reports of altercations or personal conflicts leading up to her disappearance. But investigators noticed something in her daily life that drew attention: her connection with the father of her unborn child. It was a private matter, but one that would soon play a significant role in the direction of the case. The man in question, a co-worker from the restaurant where she worked, had reportedly seen her on the day she vanished. Detectives interviewed him early on, hoping he could help fill in the gaps. According to his statement, he had given her a ride after her doctor's appointment but claimed to have dropped her off safely. It was a seemingly straightforward detail, but something about it didn't sit right with investigators. Still, without evidence of wrongdoing, they had no reason, yet, to assume foul play. Meanwhile, the community of Philadelphia began to rally in a way that few cases had inspired before. Vigils were organized, social media pages created, and volunteers fanned out across the city, distributing posters, searching alleys, abandoned lots, and wooded areas. The effort brought together hundreds of strangers united by empathy and fear. They called out her name, hoping against hope that somewhere she would answer. But the city, vast, noisy, and unforgiving, offered only silence. As the days turned into weeks, detectives widened their net. Surveillance footage was reviewed from nearby businesses, and phone records were traced to map her last known communications. The man who had given her a ride that day remained a person of interest, but without clear physical evidence, the investigation struggled to move forward. Detectives were working under immense pressure, not just from the family, but from the growing public attention. Philadelphia's news outlets carried LaToyia's story nightly. Each broadcast ended with her picture, her radiant smile, the gentle curve of her belly, and a number to call with tips. For every credible lead, a dozen false ones followed. Anonymous callers claimed sightings in nearby towns. Others suggested that she had run away voluntarily. Detectives sifted through every rumor, but none led them closer to the truth. Among those most vocal in the search was a man named Richard Blair, LaToyia's cousin. He tirelessly coordinated community efforts, speaking to reporters, posting flyers, and following up on potential leads. His determination gave the case visibility, reminding the city that a young mother-to-be was still missing. Blair's persistence became one of the defining forces behind the investigation's momentum. He refused to let her name fade from the headlines. But even with media coverage and community support, the trail remained frustratingly cold. The police conducted several ground searches in West Philadelphia, often focusing on abandoned buildings or overgrown lots. Each time, they hoped for a sign, an item of clothing, a piece of jewelry, anything that could provide a direction. Each time, they found nothing. Behind closed doors, detectives continued to re-examine the timeline of LaToyia's final day. They traced her movements from her doctor's appointment to her last confirmed communication, a phone call with a friend around midday. That friend described her as calm, in good spirits, and planning to go home soon after. There were no signs of distress, no hints of an argument. Whatever happened next had occurred in the narrow window after that call. Investigators quietly began looking more closely into the man who claimed to have dropped her off. They checked his phone records, searched his vehicle, and conducted multiple follow-up interviews. He maintained that he had done nothing wrong, that he wished for her safe return. Still, inconsistencies began to appear in his account. Small details didn't align, times didn't match, routes seemed improbable. But again, none of it was enough for an arrest. Circumstantial suspicions couldn't replace solid proof. As the summer heat bore down on the city, the emotional toll on LaToyia's family grew heavier. Her father often appeared on television, his voice breaking as he pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Friends remembered her as kind, hardworking, and dedicated to her daughter. The loss of her presence and the uncertainty of what had happened weighed on everyone who knew her. Each day without answers deepened their fear that she might never return. Then, a new lead emerged, a tip that directed investigators toward a remote area in southwest Philadelphia. Officers and volunteers searched fields, creeks, and abandoned properties. For days, they combed through terrain dense with brush and debris, hoping for anything that might provide closure. But once again, the results were devastatingly empty. By late summer, weeks had turned into months. The media's attention began to drift toward other stories, but those closest to LaToyia refused to give up. Her family continued organizing search events, joined by local activists and missing persons advocates. The case became a symbol of perseverance, of refusing to let another woman's story be forgotten. As investigators revisited their notes, they began to notice a pattern of contradictions in earlier statements. The same man who had driven LaToyia on the day she vanished now seemed increasingly inconsistent under questioning. He grew evasive, sometimes contradicting his own timeline. Detectives noted these red flags and began building a more comprehensive picture. Slowly, a narrative began to form, one suggesting that LaToyia's disappearance might not have been a random act. One detective described the feeling as walking through fog. Clues seemed to appear and vanish, fragments of truth scattered among misinformation. Yet even without definitive proof, intuition told them they were closing in on something. Still, for the family waiting for answers, progress felt painfully slow. The reality of missing persons cases, the waiting, the dead ends, the exhaustion, weighed heavily on them all. Then came a subtle but significant shift. Detectives rechecked a property connected to the suspect's known associates, a vacant lot not far from where LaToyia had last been seen. It wasn't the first time the area had been searched, but something compelled investigators to take another look. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was the quiet persistence of those who refused to let her name fade away. As officers approached the lot, overgrown with weeds and scattered debris, the quiet hum of the city seemed to fade. They had no way of knowing it yet, but this ground, forgotten, hidden in plain sight, held the key to the truth they had been searching for. The investigation was finally beginning to turn. After weeks of uncertainty, silence, and sleepless nights, the path that had led only to dead ends was about to expose what really happened to LaToyia Figueroa. And when it did, the answers would both devastate and deliver the closure her family had long prayed for. After all those months of searching, could this finally be the clue that would reveal the truth? The search had stretched across neighborhoods, creeks, and forgotten corners of Philadelphia, each new lead carrying a fragile thread of hope that frayed with every passing day. But in the late summer of 2005, as the relentless humidity began to fade, investigators returned to one area that had been searched before, a quiet, overgrown lot in southwest Philadelphia. It was here, amid the tall weeds and rusting debris, that the mystery surrounding LaToyia Figueroa would begin to unravel. Detectives had been circling around one man for weeks, the same man who had given her a ride on the day she vanished. His name had appeared in nearly every report, every conversation in the squad room. Each time he was questioned, his story shifted slightly. The inconsistencies were small, a changed time here, a forgotten detail there, but together they formed a web that didn't make sense. He said he had dropped her off safely, yet no one saw her arrive home. He said he drove straight back afterward, but phone records and traffic camera data suggested otherwise. Piece by piece, his version of events was disintegrating. As the evidence tightened, detectives decided to go back over old ground. Reviewing the initial search grid, they noticed an area near 62nd and Elmwood Avenue that hadn't been fully cleared. A patch of land behind a row of decaying industrial buildings, tangled with brush and garbage. The man they were watching had once lived only a few blocks away. It was the kind of overlooked space that could hide a terrible secret for weeks. On an August afternoon, under a gray and humid sky, officers returned with renewed purpose. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. A small team fanned out across the lot, stepping carefully through broken glass and knee-high weeds. The smell of earth and decay clung to the air. One officer paused. He noticed the ground was uneven, a section of soil darker and looser than the rest. He called to the others. They started digging. At first, it was just dirt, roots, and debris. Then, as the shovels cut deeper, something human emerged. A shoe, a trace of fabric. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The officers stepped back. The call went out to homicide. Within hours, the lot was sealed off with yellow tape, and investigators moved in quietly, methodically, with the reverence that such discoveries demand. The remains were soon confirmed to be human, and later, through dental records, identified as 24-year-old LaToyia Figueroa. Her body had been carefully concealed beneath layers of trash and soil. She was still clothed in what she had last been seen wearing. The realization hit like a wave through the department. The woman they had searched for, prayed for, and hoped to find alive was gone, and with her, the unborn child she had so lovingly anticipated. When news of the discovery broke, it rippled across Philadelphia. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Community members who had spent weeks volunteering to search gathered in tears outside the police line. Candlelight vigils were held that same night. People holding photos of LaToyia, whispering prayers, unable to comprehend how such cruelty could happen to someone so full of promise. The medical examiner's report would confirm what detectives already feared. LaToyia had been the victim of homicide. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation, consistent with an act of deliberate violence. The evidence was clear and damning. Whoever had done this hadn't acted in panic or by accident. This was personal, intentional, and final. With the cause confirmed, detectives turned immediately back to the man who had been on their radar from the very beginning. Stephen Poches, LaToyia's co-worker and the father of her unborn child. The focus on him intensified. Search warrants were obtained for his car and residence. Forensic teams combed through every inch of his property, collecting fibers, soil samples, and trace evidence. They noted the alignment between his statements and the location of the body. The proximity was too close to ignore. When detectives brought him in for questioning again, they approached it differently. This time, they confronted him not with speculation but with facts, the phone records, the inconsistencies, the discovery site. The atmosphere in the interrogation room was thick with tension. Poches sat still, avoiding eye contact, his composure slipping as detectives spoke about the remains found near Elmwood Avenue. For hours he deflected, denied, minimized, but each denial only deepened the silence between questions. Finally, under mounting pressure and evidence he could no longer explain away, Stephen Poches confessed. His words were cold, devoid of remorse. He admitted that an argument had broken out between him and LaToyia on July 18, 2005, an argument that spiraled into violence. She had confronted him about the pregnancy, about his unwillingness to accept responsibility. He claimed he snapped. In that moment, a young mother and her unborn child lost their lives. Afterward, he panicked, placed her body in his car, and drove to the vacant lot, covering her remains with debris before leaving as if nothing had happened. For investigators, the confession brought both clarity and pain. They had the truth, but the truth was unbearable. In the briefing room that night, the air was heavy with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Detectives who had spent sleepless nights on the case spoke quietly, their voices subdued. "We found her," one said simply, "but not the way anyone wanted." The news spread quickly. Reporters gathered outside police headquarters. Cameras flashed as officials confirmed the arrest. Across the city, grief gave way to outrage. How could someone who had shared her life, her trust, and her future commit such an act? It was a question that no sentence could ever fully answer. The following weeks brought a storm of attention. The case dominated headlines, not just locally, but nationally. Discussions erupted about the disparities in media coverage, how some missing persons cases garnered immediate, widespread attention while others, like LaToyia's, struggled for visibility until tragedy struck. Advocates for missing women of color called for change, demanding equal urgency and compassion. LaToyia's name became part of that conversation, a symbol of how persistence and community could force the world to pay attention. As the case moved to court, the weight of what had happened became even more evident. During the trial, Prosecutors presented the confession alongside physical evidence linking Poches to the scene. They detailed the timeline, from the doctor's appointment to the fatal argument, to the concealment of her body. Jurors listened in silence, faces drawn tight. The defense offered little more than a plea for mercy, citing emotional stress and poor judgment. But there was no justification strong enough to explain the loss of 2 lives. When the verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder, the courtroom fell into a hushed stillness. Poches showed little emotion. The judge's voice carried through the chamber as he pronounced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. A quiet gasp spread among those in attendance, a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been delivered, but the cost could never be undone. LaToyia's father sat silently, his hands clasped, tears sliding down his cheeks. Later, he told reporters, "We prayed for answers and we got them. But nothing can bring my daughter back, nothing." His words resonated beyond the courtroom. They were not about vengeance, they were about loss, about the absence left behind. After the sentencing, members of LaToyia's family gathered outside, joined by neighbors and supporters. Candles flickered in the warm evening air. People embraced, cried softly, shared memories. There was a sense of closure, yes, but also a deep sadness that lingered, knowing a young mother and her unborn child would never see another sunrise. In the weeks that followed, LaToyia's name continued to echo across Philadelphia. Her family established a small foundation to assist in searches for other missing women. Determined to transform their pain into purpose, her story inspired renewed dialogue about the visibility of victims, how every missing person deserves the same urgency, the same empathy, regardless of background or circumstance. For detectives, the memory of the case endured long after the file was closed. They spoke often of the quiet dignity of her family, of the way the community came together in her memory. They also remembered that vacant lot, once a place of silence, now a place of remembrance. The city made efforts to clear and maintain it, to ensure it would never again hide such a tragedy. The truth had been found, and justice had been served. But the emotional weight of what had been uncovered, a life full of promise extinguished in a moment of senseless violence, would never fully fade. In Philadelphia's collective memory, LaToyia Figueroa's story stood as both a warning and a testament that even in the darkest cases, truth has a way of emerging, and that love, persistence, and community can bring light to the shadows where justice hides. Justice had finally arrived, but for those who waited through months of silence and fear, closure felt both healing and heartbreaking. The morning of the trial began with a heavy stillness that hung over the courthouse like a storm waiting to break. Outside, the streets of Philadelphia were damp from an early drizzle, the kind that leaves the air cool and sharp. By dawn, a small crowd had already gathered along the courthouse steps, reporters setting up tripods, onlookers whispering, and members of the community standing quietly, holding small photos of LaToyia Figueroa. Some had known her personally. Others had only followed her story through headlines and news clips, but everyone understood the gravity of what that day represented. Inside, the courtroom was already full. The rows were tightly packed with journalists, legal observers, and family members who had waited months, some might say lifetimes, for justice. At the center of it all sat the man accused of ending her life, Stephen Poches. He appeared detached, head slightly bowed, avoiding the gaze of the crowd. A small stack of legal documents rested in front of him, untouched. To his right, his attorney leaned in occasionally, whispering in a tone too soft to carry beyond the table. Across the aisle, LaToyia's father sat in silence. His eyes were fixed forward, but his hands, clasped tightly together, trembled ever so slightly. Next to him were LaToyia's aunts, cousins, and close friends. Each of them wore a pin bearing her photo, her bright smile, forever frozen in a moment before everything changed. There was no shouting, no visible anger, only quiet determination. They had waited too long for this day. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The sound of the gavel striking once echoed through the room like a closing door. The trial had begun. The prosecution opened with the simple but powerful statement: "This is a story about trust and betrayal. About a young woman who deserved love, but instead met violence, and about a child who never had the chance to be born." The prosecutor's voice was steady, his pacing deliberate. He didn't rush. Every detail was presented like a puzzle piece placed carefully on the table. LaToyia's last day, her plans to pick up her daughter, the sudden silence, the confession that followed months later. He spoke of evidence, yes, but also of humanity. As witnesses took the stand, the reality of what had happened came into sharper focus. Detectives described the search efforts, the vacant lot, the moment they realized the remains were hers. Forensic experts explained the condition of the remains, the autopsy results, and the timeline that confirmed what the investigators had feared from the beginning. Each testimony built upon the last, the weight of truth growing heavier with every passing hour. Then came the emotional testimonies. Friends spoke of LaToyia's laughter, how it filled every room she entered. They spoke of her love for her young daughter, her excitement for the new baby on the way, and her plans for the future. One of her friends, through tears, said she was happy. She was just so happy that week. She didn't deserve this. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of muffled sobs. Even some of the jurors looked down, unable to meet the family's eyes. The defense countered, attempting to cast doubt on the premeditation element of the crime. They suggested emotional turmoil, panic, and a moment of rage. But the prosecution was unflinching. They reminded the court that this was not a crime of passion. It was a deliberate act, followed by an effort to conceal the truth. They pointed to the calm demeanor of the defendant in the days following LaToyia's disappearance, the lack of urgency in his voice when he was first questioned, the inconsistencies in his statements. When it came time for the defendant's statement, the courtroom leaned in. Stephen Poches rose slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. His words were quiet, halting. He spoke of regret, of wishing he could take it back, but never once did he say why. The apology was hollow, a string of rehearsed syllables that left the air colder than before. The judge watched him carefully, expression unreadable. After days of testimony, exhibits, and deliberation, the jury retired. Hours passed. The family waited in the hallway, surrounded by supporters and reporters. The tension was suffocating. Some prayed quietly, others simply stared at the courtroom doors, waiting for them to open again. When the jury finally returned, the air shifted, a collective intake of breath as everyone stood. The foreman, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, unfolded the paper in his hands. His voice trembled only slightly as he read the words that would close this chapter forever. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." The sound that followed wasn't applause or outrage, it was silence. The kind of silence that carries both relief and devastation. A few family members sobbed quietly, others held hands, their bodies shaking from the release of tension that had built up for nearly a year. LaToyia's father closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face, whispering a prayer of thanks. The sentencing came next. The judge, a man known for his composure, spoke with measured gravity. He called the crime an act of cowardice and spoke directly to the defendant. "You took from this family a daughter, a mother, a sister, and an unborn child. You robbed them of every future moment they might have shared." He paused before delivering the final words. "For this, you will spend the rest of your life behind bars, without the possibility of parole." Gasps rippled through the room. The gavel struck once more, sealing the verdict. The defendant was led away in handcuffs, eyes still downcast, disappearing through the side door as quietly as he had entered. Outside, the courthouse steps filled once again. Reporters crowded around, microphones extended toward LaToyia's father. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Justice was done today," he said softly. "But justice doesn't bring her back. It just means we can finally stop wondering. The cameras captured the moment, not as a victory, but as the end of a long, painful chapter. In the days that followed, Philadelphia seemed to move a little slower. The story dominated local news. Headlines that read, "Justice for LaToyia," appeared in newspapers and on evening broadcasts. Vigils were held across the city. At one, near the lot where she was found, hundreds gathered with candles, creating a sea of flickering light that stretched across the block. Someone read a poem. Another sang softly. A pastor prayed for strength and healing. Her father stood silently at the front, clutching a small framed photo of his daughter. For those who had searched for her, volunteers who had spent nights stapling flyers to lampposts and walking through abandoned lots, the closure was bittersweet. They had hoped for a miracle that never came, but even in heartbreak, there was pride. Pride in a community that had refused to stop looking. Pride in a city that had come together when it mattered most. Detectives who had worked the case later spoke of how it changed them. One said, "It reminded me that every case file has a heartbeat behind it." Another admitted that even after decades on the force, LaToyia's case was one he could never forget. The image of the vacant lot, the calls from her family, the moment of truth in the interrogation room, all of it stayed with him. The case also forced broader conversations about how missing persons cases are prioritized in the media. Advocates and journalists discussed why stories like LaToyia's often received less attention compared to others. Some pointed out that it took public outcry before her story gained traction, a stark reminder of the disparities that persist. Her case became a rallying cry for equality in coverage, emphasizing that every missing person deserves the same urgency, regardless of background. In the months following the trial, the city of Philadelphia organized an event dedicated to victims of domestic violence and missing persons. LaToyia's photo stood prominently among them. Survivors spoke about their experiences, and families of other victims shared their grief. The message was clear. Her story had sparked something far greater than one investigation. It had ignited awareness, compassion, and change. Her family continued that mission. They began speaking publicly about the warning signs of domestic abuse, the importance of community involvement, and the need for persistence when someone goes missing. Her father became a voice for families still searching, offering guidance and hope. "Don't stop," he would say in interviews. "If we had stopped, we wouldn't have found her. Keep pushing. Keep asking. Keep fighting." Years later, the empty lot where her body had been found was transformed. Volunteers cleared the debris, planted flowers, and installed a small bench beneath a young maple tree. A bronze plaque was placed nearby that read, "In memory of LaToyia Figueroa, may her story remind us to seek justice, protect one another, and never forget." It wasn't just a memorial, it was a promise that her name would never fade, that her life would always be remembered for its light, not its loss. As the years passed, her story continued to appear in documentaries, true crime retrospectives, and community vigils. To this day, her face, smiling, vibrant, expectant, still appears on screens when discussions turn to justice, empathy, and the fight for equality. She became not just a victim of tragedy, but a symbol of resilience, a name that reminded others what persistence could achieve, even in the darkest moments. For her family, each anniversary brought both pain and gratitude. They had lost more than anyone could imagine, but they had also witnessed something extraordinary, the unyielding strength of a community bound by compassion. And as the lights dim and the story reaches its close, one message lingers, that in the pursuit of justice, even in the face of heartbreak, the truth always finds its way to the surface. It might take time, it might take every ounce of faith a person has left, but it comes. And when it does, it restores something sacred. Not what was lost, but the meaning behind the search itself. In the months that followed the arrest of Stephen Poaches, the city of Philadelphia entered a period of quiet reckoning. What had begun as a missing person case had transformed into a mirror, reflecting painful truths about violence, about justice, and about who gets seen when they disappear. LaToyia Figueroa's name became more than a headline. It became a symbol of love, of resilience, of a father's unyielding fight, and of a community's refusal to look away. Her story did not fade into silence as so many others had. Instead, it illuminated deep cracks in the system that had allowed her disappearance to go unnoticed by national media for far too long. For weeks after her body was found, candlelight vigils continued. People gathered in parks, on sidewalks, in front of the very apartment building where she had last been seen. They held photographs and spoke her name softly, unwilling to let it become just another statistic. In those circles of mourning, there was both grief and resolve, the understanding that LaToyia's story demanded not only justice, but also change. Her father, Melvin Figueroa, became a voice for the voiceless. Through the heartbreak, he spoke publicly about the importance of persistence, how families of missing loved ones should never stop demanding attention, never stop asking questions. His pain was palpable, but so was his determination. He stood not only for his daughter, but for every family who had ever waited by the phone, hoping for a call that never came. The case resonated beyond Philadelphia, stirring a national conversation about media bias and how certain stories received coverage while others were left in the shadows. During the height of the search for LaToyia, many noted the contrast between the attention given to her case and others happening simultaneously, particularly cases involving white victims that dominated the airwaves. One journalist who covered the story at the time said, "If it weren't for local reporters and community pressure, LaToyia's story might never have reached the national audience it deserved." That truth became part of her legacy, a lasting testament to the importance of equitable storytelling. LaToyia's life also touched countless individuals who had never met her. She was a mother, a friend, a daughter, and a woman filled with dreams that extended far beyond her 24 years. Those who knew her described her as joyful and kind-hearted, someone who always found ways to make others laugh even during difficult times. She had been working as a waitress, balancing the demands of motherhood and pregnancy while preparing for her growing family. Her world was not one of fame or privilege. It was the world of everyday people whose lives matter just as deeply, even if their stories rarely make national news. Her death exposed not just the fragility of life, but the way tragedy can reveal the strength of those left behind. Her family refused to let her story die in vain. They became advocates for awareness and victims' rights, reminding the world that every missing person deserves to be searched for with the same urgency, the same passion, the same dignity. As the trial approached, emotions ran high. For many, the arrest of Stephen Poches brought closure, but closure is a complicated word. It does not erase the pain or restore the dreams that were lost. It simply allows those left behind to breathe again, to begin piecing together lives that will forever carry the shape of an absence. When Poches was eventually convicted and sentenced, the verdict was met with quiet tears and solemn nods. There were no cheers in the courtroom, no sense of triumph, only the heavy stillness that comes when justice finally catches up with tragedy. For Melvin, that moment was both an ending and a beginning. An ending to the long nightmare of uncertainty, and a beginning to the lifelong mission of keeping his daughter's memory alive. In the years that followed, her story became part of larger discussions about missing women of color, how their disappearances often fail to receive the same attention as others. Activists and journalists referenced LaToyia's case as a turning point, a moment when independent media and public pressure forced the national conversation to expand. Her name began appearing in academic studies, advocacy groups' campaigns, and online memorials dedicated to missing women. She became part of a growing movement, one that called for systemic change and accountability. Even 2 decades later, the ripples of her story continued to move outward. True crime communities, investigative podcasts, and awareness groups still revisit her case, not to sensationalize it, but to honor her and the lives like hers that deserve remembrance. In Philadelphia, a small mural of LaToyia was painted in the neighborhood where she once lived. Beneath her portrait were the words, "She was loved, she was wanted, she mattered." Those words captured everything her family had fought to prove, that behind every headline, behind every cold case, there is a life that once shined with possibility. The tragedy of her death left the community scarred, but also awakened. Many who had never joined a search or attended a vigil before found themselves volunteering for other missing person efforts afterward. In that sense, LaToyia's story didn't end in that vacant lot in Chester. It grew beyond it, becoming a call to action. Investigators who worked on the case later described how her disappearance had changed their approach to missing person reports, especially for young women of color. Where once a delay in media coverage might have been seen as standard, LaToyia's case became a painful reminder of what was at stake in those first crucial hours. Her story also revealed the power of community-driven justice, how ordinary people can amplify the voices that might otherwise go unheard. It wasn't just detectives who solved the case, it was the journalists, the volunteers, the neighbors, the countless individuals who refused to let the world move on without her. And for the team that worked the case, her memory remains a quiet echo in their hearts, a reminder that even when justice comes, the human cost is immeasurable. Every year, as July approaches, those who remember LaToyia light candles or post tributes online. They share her picture with the same caption, "Gone but never forgotten." Her story reminds us that justice is not only about convictions or courtrooms, it's about remembrance. It's about the dignity of saying her name, of ensuring her legacy continues to shed light where darkness once lingered. As her father once said in a quiet interview years later, "When you lose someone like that, you never stop feeling it. But when people still say her name, when they remember who she was, that's how she lives on." And so, as the lights dim on this chapter, LaToyia's story remains, a voice carried through time, a testament to perseverance, love, and the fight for equality in the search for truth. Before closing, we leave you with this reflection. How many others are still waiting, unseen, unheard, for their stories to be told? Because every name deserves to be remembered. Every family deserves answers. And every lost life, no matter how long it takes, deserves justice. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the search for justice and the untold stories behind each case. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more revealed crime stories, and we'll see you in the next one.